Anthony Edwards has received backlash for the comments he made last week, in which he said that nobody in Michael Jordan's generation outside of Michael Jordan had skills. Kevin Garnett has responded to these comments with his own take on this. And just keep in mind, Kevin Garnett was from MJ's generation. Granted, he was from the tail end, but he had some fierce words to say about this. I'm just going to read out some of the excerpts he said in response to Anthony Edwards. If I'm being honest, I do not think anybody in this generation could have played like 20 years ago. If I'm being 100, and this is to Ant, this is to everybody in our league. Tatum, everybody, let me tell y'all something. 20 years ago, you could not get to a triple step back jumper. Do you hear what I'm saying to you? You could not get to a triple step back. And then if you shot that, it had to go in. You know why? Because we had efficiency back in the day, and it was so hard. It was too physical. And guess what? The league had to come off of it for the flow of movement to be able to have scoring go up, which is why we like to sit here and watch kind of the rat race of the high-paced game right now. I'm trying to see if there's anything else. No, I don't have anything else to say, but Kevin Garnett is absolutely right. I definitely think a lot of these guys would not have been able to face the competition in the NBA what it was like 20 years ago. That was what I always say, the era from 1994, I would say up until 2006, I always called that the defensive era of the NBA, where defense was top-notch and the rules favored great defense versus offense. It was much harder to score in that era for those 12 years. And then after 2006, really starting the playoffs in 2006, they started calling the game differently. And every year they did it by increments to the point where we're now, where defense is not allowed, but offense is king essentially. The biggest thing back then I felt was that you really didn't have freedom of movement, like Kevin Garnett said, that just it was very difficult. I remember as a Spurs fan, a lot of people hating the Spurs' first championship team, the 99 team, because it was a defensive juggernaut, that it was so good defensively. You had Tim Duncan, David, and you had great perimeter defenders in Sean Elliott, Mario Ellie that could just hound guys. Just they made it impossible for guys to even get their shot up without getting stripped or blocked. Just on every possession, it was just contested. I think they had some quarters where they would hold guys to like single digits. That's how brutal that team was defensively. But I'll never forget being in high school around that time and reading an article in Sports Illustrated where the league back then was concerned what was going on, especially what the Spurs were doing defensively, because back then they were saying guys barely have any place to go on the court, that the court seems very small and it's very limited, and they were trying to think of solutions how to expand the players' ability to have movement on the court. I remember hearing some ideas where the court should be made bigger. That's how intense the defense was back then. It was just hard to get around that. And I always feel the Spurs of the late 90s and the early to mid 2000s was one of the biggest reasons why the league changed the rules, because people complained about them being quote unquote boring, not entertaining. And it was just, they were setting a trend where a lot of people were starting to copy their style of being a defensive juggernaut, valuing defense over offense, in which to win games, the Spurs were showing that you don't have to be a stacked team to win a lot of games in this league. Granted, they had, in my eyes, the best player in the league during the late 90s to mid 2000s, Tim Duncan. But you look at how they were building their team, even when they didn't have much talent during the rebuilding years after the first championship up until the second championship and so forth, that they relied heavily on defense, and they were still able to win a ton of games, around like 50 to 57 to like 64 games a year. That's how great their defense was. They could carry them to a lot of victories. They frustrated a lot of the top perimeter players in the league. I would see games where Kobe, granted he had his moments where he scored for Spurs, but he also had moments where Bruce Bowen just locked him, just straight up locked him up, put him in jail, as I would say. And you would see them do it to guys like Kobe, Ray Allen, Tracy McGrady, Just the list goes on from that era. Just it was insane. Just the defensive pressure. A lot of teams were starting to apply that throughout the league, and you're seeing guys struggling to score. I remember this was a time period in my life when I discovered field goal efficiency, because I would see guys like Tracy McGrady, Kobe, like averaging 30 points a game, and I would just think, like, it doesn't feel the same like when MJ did it. What's going on? That these guys are scoring around 27 to 30 a game, but it's not as impactful. And then I would look at their stats and compare to MJ's stats, and one thing that stood out to me was MJ had great field goal percentages, and their field goal percentages were low. It was like 45 or below, or depending on some years, which is terrible efficiency. And that's what really stood out to me. So you had guys who could score a lot back then, but they couldn't get wins because they were just not efficient enough. And that's how difficult the league was back then. It was just a very physical league. I think the physicality would get to a lot of these guys today for sure. Just do I think some of these guys would still be 20-point scorers or even 30-point scorers? Yes. But the key difference is the efficiency. Efficiency would be completely different. And because the efficiency would go down, they wouldn't be able to win as many games, and thus they would lose their effectiveness. That's the way I look at it. But these guys really do benefit from these rules for sure. I remember another thing I just like to bring up is that back then, what you would consider traveling would not be traveling in today's league. So when you see all these guys doing these amazing tricks with the ball, it's not like the players back then couldn't do that. They could, but they would be called for traveling because that was the rules back then. They changed the rules, like Garnett was saying, with these triple step backs simply to allow more freedom of movement. The triple step back would be illegal 20 years ago. That would be called for a travel. I'll never forget when and one was really big during the 2000s. I don't know if some of you young people ever heard about the and one tour. If you didn't, go look it up. It was a bunch of these street ballers that went on a tour across the country. They had a show, I think, on ESPN for like a good 3 to 4 years, in which they would do tricks on the court. They would play 5-on-5, basketball game against their other people in their and one league and whatnot. But it was mainly a bunch of them doing tricks. Think of like the street version of the Harlem Globetrotters. That's who they would have been. Just they were doing tricks with the basketball. They were stuff that you wouldn't see in an NBA game when it came to dribbling moves and all the other stuff. I remember NBA players being upset about it back then because some people were saying the N1 ballers had better ball handling skill than NBA players. And I remember hearing interviews with NBA players in which they said straight up, like, hey, we can do all those moves too. But if we did that in our league, we would be called for traveling. If they did those moves in our league, they would be called for traveling. But trust and believe, if we could do these moves, we would be even more dominant in what you see currently. I remember a lot of NBA players speaking out about that. And it's interesting now the NBA changed the rules to allow these and one tricks to happen on the court. I don't find them enjoyable. Then again, I never really enjoyed the and one tour. To me, it was a ripoff of money. One time I paid tickets to see that many years ago when I was in college. Complete trash basketball. And unfortunately, they brought that to the league. I do miss the defense because I like the competition much better. Even if I hated the player back then, at least I could respect them more because they had to overcome intense defensive pressure. Today, not so much. The game is very favorable to perimeter players. So it's really designed to protect perimeter players from a marketing perspective, if you think about it, because the most popular players in NBA history, if you think of them from the top of your head, they're all mostly perimeter players, maybe with the exceptions of Shaq, I would say, who was probably the most popular big man of all time. But outside of that, they've all been perimeter players. Maybe Victor Wembanyama will break that mold in upcoming years. He's very charismatic, very marketable, but we'll see. But you get what I'm saying. I definitely agree with Kevin Garnett. These guys would struggle 20 years ago. They wouldn't be as effective for the most part. I definitely do believe that. That's all I have to say.